Welcome to Lectures on Symmetry Optics. I'm Paul Mirsky. This is Lecture 3 of the series, and the topic is Static and Live and the Source Target Grid. In the previous lecture, we considered many-slit interference in the lens-limited configuration. The setup has an illuminating beam, a grating, a lens, and a screen. But we really only analyzed patterns at two special planes: the front flat at the grating and the rear flat at the screen. These are the special planes where the wavefronts have zero curvature. Everywhere else, the wavefronts are curved. Now, we'll be looking at the free configuration, which means that there is no lens and no rear flat. And instead of considering only the flat, we'll consider all the other planes too. To understand these, we will need to introduce the concepts of static and live. As we'll discuss, static stays constant while live grows and changes. Here's the pattern directly at the grating, seen with a camera. As the camera moves away from the grating, we see that the patterns will start to change in interesting ways that are too complex to summarize in just a few words. Let's take a minute to watch. These are the patterns that we'll learn to calculate. We'll use a new type of algorithm that is unique to symmetry optics. But before we do, it's helpful to first review a similar technique that you might already know, namely the Huygens-Fresnel principle. We're given some initial conditions, which we call a primary wavefront. Here, we're showing a simple plane wave, but it can be any pattern. A point on the primary wavefront acts like a source and emits a secondary wavefront, which is a spherical wave that radiates out. That spherical wave is one example of a point spread function, which is how you describe the effect of a single point source. But actually, each and every point on the primary wavefront acts as a source, and each one independently emits an identical secondary wavefront. These secondary wavefronts propagate and overlap, and they can either reinforce one another or cancel out, depending on their phases. These are the phenomena of constructive and destructive interference. When all the secondary wavefronts are added together, the net result is a new primary wavefront. You can now calculate another cycle, or you can stop here. In mathematical terms, this whole process is a convolution. Take a starting pattern, convolve it with a point spread function, and you get a new pattern. The reason for this review is that Huygens-Fresnel has some rough analogies with symmetry optics. The analogies are not perfect, but at least they will give you some idea of what these new terms mean. The static is like the primary wavefront because it's our initial conditions, and we treat it like a collection of individual sources. The live is like the secondary wavefront because it's one common pattern that is emitted by each source. The source target grid is somewhat similar to interference because it's how we combine all of the different instances of live. And there is no analogy to the new primary wavefront. When you find the distribution in some plane, you can't use it as the starting point for a new cycle of calculations the way you can with Huygens-Fresnel. With this introduction to orient us, let's talk about static. The flat is the starting point for many-slit interference. A flat wavefront illuminates the grating, and some light passes through the slits. The pattern here consists only of static. We can represent the static as a single factor chain. The flat is one extreme. The opposite extreme is the far limit, which is the plane that we set as the boundary of the system. Here we see two factor chains, static and live. We usually draw the static in dark gray and the live in colors. If you look at the details of the live at the far limit, it will look familiar because it's just like the calculation we did in Lecture 2. The static and live have all the same factor sizes, but the rank order is reversed from ABCD to DCBA. And also, the types are inverted from plenary to singular and vice versa. But the calculation in Lecture 2 was about something else. That was in the lens limited configuration. We were given a pattern at the front flat, and we calculated the pattern at the rear flat. Those chains described two different planes. Also, both of the patterns were static only. Here is different. Both chains are present simultaneously in the same plane. One is static, the other is live. We've seen the extreme cases. Now let's look at the intermediate cases. This slide shows both the static and live for many different planes. At the bottom is the flat, where the live is 0. At the top is the far limit, which we just saw in the previous slide. The overall trend is that as the light propagates, the live chain moves to the right. Each new factor always appears first at the lowest rank. The existing factors rise higher in rank, but otherwise they don't change. The rule is that the live total width is equal to z, which is the distance away from the flat given in wavelengths. So for instance, at z equals AB, the live total width is AB. And at z equals 0, which is the flat, the live total width is 0, which is equivalent to saying that there is only static, no live. Notice, though, that the static remains constant for all planes. That's why it's called the static. The live grows and changes, which is why it's called the live. Now for the nuts and bolts. Let's work through an example and calculate the live step by step. Here's our static, and let's assume that we want the live at z equals 36. Step 1 is to find a low-ranking static subchain with a total width of 36, or whatever z is. The process is pretty simple. Starting at the lowest rank, we include factors until the product is 36. So, factor A is size 3. Factors A and B together give us 3 times 2, which is 6. Factors A, B, and C together give us 3 times 2 times 6, which is 36. That gives us our subchain, so we're done with step 1. Now, we turn the subchain into the live. Step 2 is to reverse the rank order, so ABC becomes CBA. Then we invert each type. So for instance, A goes from plenary to singular, etc. This gives us the live at the plane z equals 36. Next, we will try the same static, but at z equals 24 rather than at z equals 36. We begin exactly the same by including factors A and B, but when we try to include factor C, we see that it overshoots our target because we only want to get to 24, but factor C would bring our product to 36. So AB is too little, but ABC is too much. This problem is very common. In fact, there are only a few planes where it doesn't occur. The solution is to include only part of factor C. The trick is to break factor C up into 2 subfactors, C1 and C2. To do this, just remember 2 things. First, both subfactors are the same type as the total factor. So C1 and C2 are both plenary. Second, the 2 subfactor sizes have to multiply to the total, not add. So 6 splits into 4 and 1.5, not 4 and 2. We could have chosen sizes 3 and 2, or any other pair that multiplies to 6, but we chose 4 as the size for C1 because that's the size that we need in order to get to 24. Now we can include factor C1, and this gives us 3 times 2 times 4, which is 24. Now we have our subchain. Next, we reverse the order and invert the types. This gives us the live at z equals 24. This algorithm is pretty easy to do by hand, but you can also do it in software. Wherever you found this video, you'll also find a link to the companion code for this course. This is a set of functions and classes written for MATLAB, and you can learn a lot from it. MATLAB is pretty cheap if you're a student or a home user. If you're a professional, then it costs more. There may also exist free software that can run MATLAB code, but I can't vouch for it. This lecture will show some brief demos of the companion code. We won't narrate every single detail, but hopefully you can follow the basic flow. The key thing is to inspire you to check out the code for yourself. I'm opening up the file called calclive_msi.m. MSI stands for many slit interference. We're going to do the same calculation we just did a moment ago. The code is over here in the left pane. When you press run, it does the calculation and it reports the answer as text here in the right pane. Here it shows the static, the z, and the live. The static and live are written as chains of sizes and types. The lower ranking factors appear at the bottom. Let's take a closer look at the code. I'll set a breakpoint at the first line so that we can step through one line at a time. I'll press run, and we stop at the breakpoint. Pressing step, we can go one line at a time through the code. The first few lines just clear up the workspace so that we're starting fresh. Then we set the static sizes and types, and we call the function listFactorChain, which just prints the static chain to the screen. Then we set z equals to 24. Then we create an object called calc, which is an instance of the calclive class. When we hover with the mouse, we see that it has a bunch of properties, but they mostly just show pairs of empty brackets, which means that the properties are all empty. Next, we assign the static sizes and types to the properties. And when we hover again, we see that those properties are now filled in. The next line is where the real calculation happens. We call the function calclive@z with z as an argument. And when we hover again, we see that even more properties are filled in. Those are our outputs. Now we call listFactorChain again, and it prints the live. That's it. We'll run the code one more time, but this time, when we get to the function calclive@z, we'll press step in. This will take us to the code that defines the calclive class. We'll skip over some of the details, but the important part is this loop. We cycle through the loop on the condition while subchain product is less than target z, just as when we calculated by hand. I'll set a breakpoint at the bottom of the loop and press continue to execute up to the breakpoint. When I hover, you can see that we are keeping a list of the subchain sizes and types. And because it's only been one pass through the loop, the lists are only one item long. But when I press continue again, it passes through the loop a second time, and now they're 2 items long. And now 3 items long. Now we step through a few more lines to reverse the rank and invert the types, and now we return to the calling function and continue to the end and print out our result. Now we're done. As I said before, it's okay if you didn't follow every step. The main thing is just to alert you that this code is available and to motivate you to download it and run it yourself. Now that we've discussed how to calculate live, we'll move on to the next step, which is to combine the static and live in the source target grid. We'll illustrate by working through an example. Again, we start with the static parameters a, b, c, and d, which in this case are 2, 2, 4, and 2. We are also given z, which in this case is 16. The first 3 steps are to calculate the live at z equals 16, as we did earlier. We won't work through all the steps, we'll just show the result here. Up to now, we've been representing the light with factor chains, but it can also be represented as spatial patterns, which is how the light actually looks in space. Step 4 is to calculate the spatial patterns for both static and live. We use the algorithms that were taught in the previous lecture, and we get these patterns for the static and live respectively. They are vectors of zeros and ones, a 0 for each dark patch and a 1 for each bright patch. They can also be drawn as diagrams. We use light blue to represent zeros. Any other color represents ones. Also, note that all of the factor sizes need to be integers or else we can't calculate these patterns. Because of this, the algorithm doesn't work for all values of z. In a later lecture, we'll learn a different algorithm that lets us get around this limitation. Each and every bright patch of the static is an independent source patch. In this case, there are 8 source patches. Together, they make up the grading pattern that we see at the flat. We now introduce the source target grid. This is a 2-dimensional table. Each column corresponds to one of the target patches where we want to know the interference pattern. Each row corresponds to one of the source patches. Each cell of the grid contains a single number. At first, the grid is completely filled with zeros. We usually just represent the zeros with light blue cells, but this slide actually writes them out. In the next step, we overwrite some of these zeros with ones. Step 5 of our procedure is to tabulate the source target grid. Each source patch emits one instance of live, and we tabulate it by writing it into the source target grid as a string of zeros and ones. Horizontally, the live is centered above the source patch that emitted it, as you see here. Vertically, each instance is tabulated into a different row. This is the first source patch, so it's in the first row of the grid. We follow this same procedure for all the source patches. The live from the second patch is centered above the second patch and tabulated into the second row. And so on, and so on. And the tabulation is now complete. Note that even though the rows are arrayed vertically in our diagram, they are not at different distances from the flat. The entire grid all applies to just one plane. Also, note that we often draw each instance in a different color, but that's only to help you tell them apart. Formally, they're all just represented as ones, and we will eventually drop the colors once they're no longer convenient. Now that we see how the source target grid is used, let's look at the dimensions of the grid. If n is the number of source patches, then there are n rows in the grid. If L is the live wide limit and S is the static wide limit, then the grid has a total of L plus S minus 1 columns. This is the size we need if we want to be able to tabulate every possible case. But in practice, it's usually possible to get by with far fewer columns. This is because most of the source target grid is usually just filled with zeros representing dark space. We often aren't really interested in those regions, so we trim the grid to the limits of the bright patches, which is this red border. This makes it a much more manageable size, especially when the amount of dark space is large. The sixth and last step is to collapse the source target grid into the distribution, which will be our answer. Effectively, we simply count the number of bright patches in each column. So for instance, this column contains 2 bright patches, so the distribution is 2. This column contains no bright patches, so the distribution is 0. Formally, we represent the distribution with a vector of natural numbers, although we can also diagram it with a diagram like this. Note that we stop tracking which row each patch is in or what color it is. That information effectively gets erased. This whole step is somewhat analogous to interference, because at each target patch, we collect the contribution from all of the sources. But here, there are no phases to cancel, and therefore we don't think of it as destructive interference. We just think of it as dark patches of the live all lined up. The distribution tells us how the light actually appears in the target plane. Each column represents one target patch. If the distribution is 0, then it appears dark. If it's anything besides 0, then it appears bright. In the simplest interpretation, there are no shades of gray, so a 2 isn't brighter than a 1. But the number of patches in a column does have a physical interpretation. It's the number of different source patches that emit light to that target patch. That number is called the roundness. For example, in the new example sketched here, each target patch receives light from 2 source patches. So the roundness is 2. Roundness is a concept that is unique to symmetry optics, although it's related to wavefront curvature in conventional optics. Note that at the flat, the roundness is 0, just like the name suggests. We don't have a precise way to visualize roundness, but we can loosely imagine each target patch as a gemstone with many discrete facets. The facets are flat, and they are all the same, except that each one is oriented at a different discrete angle and faces towards a different source patch. This gem does not have 360 degrees of facets as a real gem would. Instead, it's like a wedge cut from a gem, like a slice of pie, and it subtends a smaller angle, some fraction of 360 degrees. The roundness is the number of discrete facets. This one on the left has roundness 3. The one on the right has roundness 6. There's actually one additional step in the calculation, but it's optional. Roundness, like wavefront curvature, is actually somewhat tricky to observe experimentally. So for many practical purposes, we simply ignore roundness and consider only whether each patch appears bright or dark. This level of reduction is called the screen pattern. It's what you can observe directly on a screen in the target plane or with a camera. You can use a variety of tools to do these tabulations. The simplest option is to use a sheet of graph paper. A more convenient tool is to use a spreadsheet program. Let's assume that you've already got the static and live calculated as vectors of 0s and 1s. In the static, we count 8 1s, or 8 source patches, so we set aside 8 rows to make the source target grid. Now, highlight the live and copy it with right-click and copy. Next, go to the first source patch and find the first row and paste. It's not centered on the source patch, it's shifted over to the right, but for now it doesn't really matter. Now, do the same thing for all the other source patches. And here we have a tabulated source target grid. In principle, all these other cells are filled with 0s, but again, it doesn't really matter. To collapse the grid, you can take the sum of the columns, and that tells you the distribution. Once you've done a few problems by hand and have a solid grasp of how the algorithm works, it's much easier to do it using the companion code, especially when the sizes are larger. Let's try another demo. First, I'll open the file factors and spatial msi.m. Here we have the inputs to the problem we just did, the static chain and z. Press run to execute the code, and it draws both the static and the live, and it draws them each in 2 ways, as a factor chain and as a spatial pattern. Also, in the right pane, we see the spatial patterns represented as vectors. Next, I'll open up the file calcstg_msi. Up at the top, we have the inputs, the static chain and z. Press run, and it draws 2 windows which contain the diagrams. Here are the live, the static, and the source target grid. And over in this window, we have the grid, plus the distribution and the screen pattern. One final problem for this lecture. Up to now, we've only considered static and live in the context of many-slit interference, but the principles are equally valid for the beam. The only difference is that there are fewer factors in the chain. Here's an example of the static for a beam. It consists of just two factors, a size 8 plenary and a size 9 singular. We're looking for the distribution at z equals 24. We'll begin by calculating the live. First, we look for the static subchain that's 24 patches wide. To start, we include factor A. Next, we see that we have a factor of 3 left to go in order to arrive at 24. Factor B is larger than 3, so we split it into two factors with the lower factor size 3. We include the lower factor B1, and this gives us a static subchain of the size we need. Then we reverse rank and invert type and get the live. From the factor chains, we calculate the spatial patterns. These are the inputs to the source target grid. We'll tabulate the source target grid using the file calcstg_beam. And here are the results. That's all for this lecture, so let's review the steps to calculate the pattern in any plane. Number 1, find the static subchain with a total width of z. Number 2, reverse the rank order. Number 3, invert each type. Number 4, calculate spatial patterns for static and live. Number 5, tabulate the source target grid. Number 6, collapse the source target grid into the distribution. And 7, optionally, you can ignore the roundness to find the screen pattern. Let's review a few other key points. A single plane contains both static and live. The distance z equals the live total width. The roundness is the number of source patches that emit light to each target patch. The same rules work for both many-slit interference and the beam. Wherever you found this video, you'll also find links to more resources for learning symmetry optics. The lecture notes are basically this video but in written form. Sometimes it's better to read it than to hear it. Also, try solving the problems in the problem set. It's a great way to get familiar with the principles of static and live. In the next lecture, we'll apply those principles to explore the structure of the beam. So please join me. I'm Paul Mirsky. Thanks for listening.